One for the past few years. I've worked for Uber Eats during winter break. College lets out for a whole month. And Uber Eats is the easiest job to do without having to go through job interviews and all that stuff. In addition, I didn't work during school, so this was something easy to pick up on the holidays. It was a few weeks before Christmas when this happened, and it was snowing pretty heavily. But I really couldn't be picky about which day I worked because I only had the time off to earn enough money until the next break. I borrowed my dad's pickup truck and got behind the wheel. The snow must have kept many other drivers at home because I was receiving large, well-paying orders all night long. I did this for about 3 hours before an order came in to be picked up from a drive-through location. The house was 20 minutes away, but the tip and everything was really good. Honestly, there was nothing out of the ordinary about this order. It was just like any other. I picked it up and headed to the house. Based on a quick glance at the map, it appears to be in a lovely neighborhood on the other side of the county. I had previously visited the area, but not really inside the neighborhoods. By this point, it was 11 p.m., and a lot of snow had begun to accumulate on the roads. I was also getting tired, so I decided that this would be the final delivery before returning home to work the following day. Once I arrived at the neighborhood, I drove down the street and observed the houses as I passed by. They were all it took a while to get to the address I was supposed to deliver to because the driveway was covered in at least a foot of snow. I parked on the road, got out, and walked up to the house, getting snow all over my pants and shoes. I noticed that no lights were on in the windows, and there was a piece of paper taped to the front door. Once I reached the porch, I took a closer look at the top of the page, revealed a notice in large red font in the first few lines that said it was issued by the county. However, before I could go very far, I heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind me. I turned around and saw a man approaching me from around the garage. He had a short buzz cut and was wearing a filthy jacket. "Just dropping off your order," I said to break the silence, but the man kept approaching without saying anything once he was a few feet away. I guess it was just a gut feeling, but I could tell there was something wrong with him. He gave me a cold, weary look and held out his hand for the bag. I reached over and gave it to him, but he didn't move. He was standing directly on the path leading to the driveway. As the seconds went by, I became aware of how odd it was for him to be outside at all, and even more so that he wasn't going inside now that he had the bag. I stepped aside and began to walk by him, saying, "Have a good night, sir." The man remained where he was before suddenly turning and from the corner of my eye. It appeared as though he swung his arm out in an attempt to grab me. I staggered back and turned to face him as he started to move toward me, saying, "Come with me," while extending his hand. I kept retreating as quickly as I could through the heavy snow, and the man kept chasing me, yelling at me to stop running. Once I gained a firm grip, I was able to outrun him and get into my car, backing out before he could even reach me. As I drove away, I noticed the man standing in my mirror, and merely observing after I left the neighborhood, I called the police, but the man had already left later that night. They informed me that no one currently owned the house, so I assumed the note on the door had something to do with what the man was attempting to do. However, the entire incident has made me nervous every time I drive up to a house with all of its lights off, wondering if it might be the same. My friend Jason rented out an Airbnb on the outskirts of the town we were in. I carpooled with my other friend Christian, and we met Jason there on New Year's Eve around noon. Last year, my two best friends and I decided it would be fun to get together and rent out a house for the night. We weren't big on going to huge parties, but rather enjoyed hanging out among our small group. Since we all lived in dorm rooms, having a house to ourselves for once. The interior wasn't as good, but this was one of the less expensive locations available, so none of us were expecting luxury. We spent the day simply hanging out in the living room and chatting. At around 6, Christian went out to the store to get some snacks and drinks, while Jason and I were still sitting in the living room. The house was a normal one, all wood, and with the typical cabin features. There were other similar looking cabin houses nearby, but they all had a decent spacing between them, so it felt like we were out there alone. There was a knock on the door, and we looked at each other in shock because we knew it was strange for someone to be out here knocking on the door of an Airbnb. I got up and peered out the peephole to see a man standing on the doorstep. I saw that the door had one of those metal latches on it, so I flipped it over and opened it just enough to see them. Normally, I wouldn't answer the door to a stranger, but since I was in someone else's home, I wasn't sure if it was the host or anything. The man glanced at me, and I could see right away that he wasn't happy. He seemed upset about something, and when he opened his mouth, he told me in a disrespectful and obstinate manner that we should keep quiet tonight and not disturb the entire neighborhood. The way he said it was almost menacing, as if we had already made noise, but we hadn't done anything loud or planned to, and all the houses were so far apart that even if he were a neighbor, there was no way he could hear anything unless we were setting off fireworks or something. And I really wasn't in the mood to the next 3 hours pass quickly as we watched a movie and played some games on Jason's Switch. At nearly midnight, we heard something outside that sounded like someone dropping something on the ground. A few seconds later, I closed the door in his face after he banged on it again. I ignored him that time, making a face at Jason like this guy was crazy. We heard him leave after a moment, and when Christian returned, we told him about the encounter, and he almost didn't believe us. The same man from earlier was standing by Christian's car, which now had glass covering it from his broken windshield. He was holding a metal baseball bat and appeared to be in a psychotic state, pacing around and going crazy. Christian was furious and stormed outside to confront him, so Jason and I went to stop him. The piercing sound of glass breaking came from right outside the door. All of us got up and ran to look out the window. However, before we even reached the doorway, a gunshot echoed through the cabin. I stopped in place, knowing what had probably happened, but it felt almost miraculous when I saw Christian sprint back inside and lock the door behind him. A few more shots struck the cabin side, followed by the man swinging the bat against the front door. Then, just as abruptly as it all began, the man simply fled. An investigation revealed that he wasn't even one of the Airbnb's neighbors, where he lived, or even why he went completely insane. It was an extremely dangerous and unpredictable encounter that nearly took our lives. I was driving to my neighbor's dash in early February of last winter, and I was a little worn out because I had been driving for the past 4 hours, and it was almost 12 in the morning. After this one, I was definitely going to call it a night and head home because I was afraid of falling asleep on the road, especially with all the ice and snow. I was traveling down a relatively deserted side road that connected two of our city's major towns, but there was a 5-meter stretch that I don't really know what happened, but as I was driving down this section, I was hit by a wave of fatigue that made me lose focus on the road for a few seconds. I guess I hit a patch of ice and slid toward the side, and even though I fully woke up at this point, it was too far gone. I tried to steer back onto the road, but my car just slid straight off and into the small ditch between the road and the woods. It wasn't a bad crash at all because the snow lessened the impact, made me a little unsteady, and I immediately realized that there would be no way out of this situation. My car was stuck on the ditch's incline in heavy snow, so I didn't even bother getting out to see how bad it was. I did try to maneuver the car to get some traction, but if anything, I just made it worse. While I was trying to figure everything out, I noticed the car's headlights down the road. At first, I thought it was just a passing by, but after a few seconds it was obvious that someone must have been parked down the road with their headlights on. The coincidence that it was on this long, deserted road, and they weren't close enough to stop and try to help me, but they weren't far enough to miss my headlights, which I found a bit unsettling. Knowing my dad would still be up, I took out my phone and called him in the hopes that he could assist me. I really didn't know what to do because I had never been in a scenario like this. He promised to call roadside help and then drive down to wait with me. I thanked him and looked back out on the road, relieved that he would be down here in a few minutes. searching for the headlights from the car I had just seen, but they had vanished. It was too dark to see anything that far without light, so I wasn't sure if they had driven off or were still there. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I couldn't take my eyes off the road for more than a few seconds as I started to feel worried. There was something about the silence that made me feel even more uneasy. All I could hear outside my car was the wind. After waiting for 3 minutes, I saw a figure approaching my car from the direction where the headlights had been coming down the road. I watched him slowly make his way through the snow until he was only about 15 feet from the front of my car, at which point he stopped and stood there in the snow facing me without moving. I couldn't see much of him because he had a hoodie covering his face, but the way he just stood there in my headlights started to frighten me, so I honked my horns a few times to let them know that I was in the car and that I could see them, but they didn't move or acknowledge me. However, as I was taking out my phone to call my dad again, the man turned around and disappeared down the road. I called my dad to let him know about this really strange person that was out here, and he said he was only a minute away. This time, I continued talking to him on the phone, and just 30 seconds later, I saw headlights turn on down the street and start to approach my car once they were directly across the street. After parking, they switched off their lights. My dad's car pulled right in front of me and screeched to a stop. I heard him yell at someone as they got back in their car and sped away. They didn't come back, but my dad said the guy was holding something in his hands that looked like he was going to break into my car. Everything went well after that, and the car didn't even have much damage. However, I couldn't see over the ditch. I'm not sure what was going to happen that evening, but I consider myself quite fortunate to not have discovered. I work part-time at a gas station in my city, which is more on the outskirts of the city close to the suburbs. It's just a regular gas station. It's not particularly eerie, remote, or anything like that. I just actually choose to work there. However, because rent prices were rising and my other job wasn't paying enough, the only shift I could work to accommodate my other schedule was overnight, and gas stations are among the few places that offer those shifts. This was only 10 months ago, and aside from the fact that it was quite cold outside and there was still some snow on the ground from a recent heavy downpour, the night was going fairly normally because it was in the suburbs, with only a few cars passing by every now and then. A few minutes later, I heard the door open and turned around to see a man approaching the front desk. He leaned over the counter and looked both ways as if he were looking for someone to help him. "Can I help you with something?" I asked as I made my way back to the front desk. By 12, only a few cars were entering the gas station every hour. After a while, I got bored enough to leave the front desk and walk around the store, rearranging the items on the shelves to look nice. The man turned to face me, almost as if I had scared him, but he hesitated before saying, "No, I'm good," and leaving the store. It was clear that he needed assistance with something, but I immediately thought of the potential robbery he was planning because I worked at a gas station, so it was kind of always on my mind. I watched the man go outside and get into a car that was parked in an odd location, kind of close to the pumps, but not really in the parking section. Away after a few minutes of thinking that this was definitely an attempted robbery, I called the police to report it in case they were going to try another gas station. They said an officer would come by in a few minutes to get a report, so I hung up and waited. But not even a minute later, that same car pulled up. I had no way of knowing he was actually planning something, but all the signs pointed to it. I figured maybe being behind him when he walked in instead of at the counter threw him off, and somehow that was enough to deter him. They returned to the parking lot and waited there with the car running, but I was almost certain that I could see movement in both front seats, as if there were at least 2 people inside. I quickly locked the front doors and braced myself for what might happen as I kept staring out the window, even though the car remained there and no one got out, as if they were watching or waiting for the right moment. Fortunately, police pulled in and immediately recognizing the car as I described it, They pulled in behind it and blocked them in. Surprisingly, there wasn't much of a scene. The officer essentially just walked up and pulled two men out, one of whom was the guy who had come in earlier. I suppose they were trying to play it off like they weren't doing anything, but that didn't really work out for them. Although their plan appeared to be simple, their car revealed a different, more unsettling possibility. In the trunk, there was a stash of weapons, rope tape, and a variety of similar items. Both men are currently in jail. This took place in 2015. I had just moved to a small house far from my hometown the year before, so I was still getting used to the area and hadn't met many people yet I worked from home as well, which made it even harder anyway for Christmas. I had no plans at all. My family was too far and I didn't have enough vacation time to go out and see them, so this was actually going to be my first Christmas alone. On Christmas Eve I stayed up working, figuring I'd just get ahead on some things so I didn't have to worry about doing anything on Christmas Day. Was working in the living room, listening to music as well. When through it I heard something coming from outside. I pulled out one of the earbuds and listened, but didn't hear anything else, so I got up and looked around with my earbuds, and it was hard to know what direction it came from, but I was pretty sure it was outside the house, not inside. I looked out the back window, not seeing anything, then moved to the front window and again saw nothing, but then I looked out the front door. On the porch were a set of shoe prints in the snow. They led right up to my doorstep and then back out to the driveway. There was no mail dropped off or anything at all on the porch, just the footprints. I didn't know why anyone would be approaching my door at 11 o'clock p.m. on Christmas Eve, so I made sure the door was locked, returned to work, and quickly went to bed. It was a little weird to wake up on Christmas morning feeling like it was any other day, so I made a cup of coffee and watched TV while seated on my recliner. I believe I sat there watching television and movies all morning. I called my parents and spoke with them for a short while, but that was about all I did. I considered going outside, but it was quite cold and windy, so I decided to spend the day indoors. By 6 p.m. had made dinner and planned to go to bed early after essentially doing nothing all day. But then I heard something outside. I heard footsteps shuffling through the snow as they approached the front door. I remained silent because I knew no one should be there. But after a short while, the footsteps sounded again. They left the house. I went up to check and saw nearly the exact same scene as the night before, so I forced myself to stay up later. I kept my eyes open until probably around 10 before I fell asleep on the couch. I remember getting really tired and trying to stay up, but I didn't plan to. I fell asleep outside, and when I woke up, the TV was still on and flashing light throughout the dark room. I sat up, paused it, and then got up to go to my bedroom. As I walked down the hallway, my eyes immediately locked on my bedroom door, which was open even though I knew I always kept it closed. I went over and pushed it open wider, then flicked on the light, leaving wet shoe prints all over the floor heading to and from the window in a state of complete shock. The police did what they could, but if I'm being honest, they weren't very helpful. The current theory is that the man had come by the previous 2 nights to see if I was home, not answering the door, even though he probably thought I was away for the holidays. I know it's likely that he only broke into my house to rob me, but it's still very disturbing, especially since I was at home sleeping when it all happened. I spun around and turned on the hallway light. This occurred in January of last year. I had taken a week off work after New Year's, primarily in the hopes that everyone would be back at work by then and I could enjoy the week without it being busy everywhere. My plans included shopping and spending time alone at my apartment. On this particular day, I drove through the snow, visited a few stores, and returned to the apartment by 7 p.m. after going inside to cool off. I sat down on the couch with some freshly purchased munchies, watched TV, and even dozed off for a little while. After a long day away from home, my apartment's PA system buzzed at around 8:30, indicating that someone was outside and wanted me to let them in. Since I had no plans for anyone to visit, I had no idea who it was, so I got up and went to the window facing the front of the building. I tried not to lift the blinds too much, as that I could see who it was. A big man at the apartment building's door. It was still snowy outside and somewhat dark, but I could tell he was older, maybe in his mid-40s, but I had never seen him before. There were only 3 other people living in the complex at the time, so I was at least familiar with who lived here, and he wasn't one of them. I also reasoned that, if he did live here or was visiting one of the other people, they would let him in. I went to the PA system and muted it before returning to the couch and watching TV. I didn't give it any more thought, and eventually I turned off the TV and went to bed. So it must have been around 10. I fell asleep almost as soon as I lay down. A few hours into the night, I heard a thud outside my room. It was very loud, but I didn't know what it was or where it came from. My heart was pounding as I looked across the room at my door, listening for anything else. Now, it was very quiet, almost like nothing at all occurred. I got out of bed, walked slowly over to the door, and leaned my ear against it to listen to the other side. It was still quiet, nothing more than the building's walls creaking. I turned the handle, looked out into the living room, and saw nothing unusual. The entire space was extremely dark, but for some reason I still felt that I needed to be quiet and not make myself known. So I left the lights off as I went through the living room and looked down the front hallway. The door to my apartment was completely open. I froze, staring at the open doorway and feeling so terrified that it almost seemed unreal. I took a few steps back, remaining silent, and headed back toward my room, when I noticed a large dent in the wood near the knob on the other side of the door. I ran in, locked it behind me, and called 911 while hiding in the closet. I was certain that whoever it was had to be inside my apartment still, and it would only be a matter of time before they entered room. But as I waited for the police, the apartment remained silent. Whoever had broken into my apartment was gone, and even the police were unable to find anything to help them find them. They believed that the intruder tried buzzing all the other rooms until one of them was kind enough to let them in once he was in the main staircase. It's not really clear why he chose to go for my room. Perhaps they thought it was empty. What's really odd is the dent on my bedroom door, which was probably caused by frustration before he left. I still live in the same apartment. Unbeknownst to me, last year my roommate moved out of the house we had been renting together for the previous 4 years. By then, both of us had better jobs, were earning more money, and the house wasn't the best, so it was only a matter of time until one of us moved out to get their own place. However, after he moved, I was able to use more of the space in the house and actually decided to stay there for another year or 2. This happened in early December, when our area was experiencing a week of severe snowstorms, and my employer allowed us to work from home for a few days if we so desired. Make an offer. I used my old roommate's bedroom as an office and worked throughout the day, but at one point, while I was working, there was a knock at the front door. I left the room and checked who it was. There was a man on the porch in a heavy winter jacket. He didn't seem to be a worker or delivery person of any kind, just some regular guy. I opened the door, getting hit by a rush of snow and wind. How can I help you?" The man smiled and apologized for interrupting my day, then explained his situation. He said his car got stuck in the snow right on the side of the road next to my house, and he didn't have a phone on him, so he asked if he could borrow mine. Obviously skeptical, I told him to give me a minute, then I closed the door and went to the other side of the house. I looked out the window at the road he was supposedly stuck on. There was a small SUV that looked like it had actually slid into the curb and got unstuck in the snowbank. Now that I was pretty sure he wasn't lying, I grabbed a jacket and put on some shoes, then went back to the front door. Even though I was still a little skeptical, I stood on the porch with him while he used my phone to call his brother, so that if he tried to run away with it or anything, I could chase after him or stop him from leaving. After a brief call, the man gave my phone back, thanked me, and left. I went inside and looked out the window to see the man getting into his car, thinking that everything was resolved. At around 7, I returned to the office and resumed working because I felt like I had done enough for the day and took the remainder of the night off. I went to check on the man in his car after remembering about him. I was shocked to see that the car was still there and that I could see the man moving around inside. It had been nearly 3 hours by then, so I wondered how he was still there. Maybe he was waiting for his brother to come get him from work, but I didn't know. I went to the kitchen, made dinner, and then sat on the couch to watch TV. I stayed up until about 9:30 before going upstairs to take a quick shower and get ready for bed. Was an abrupt and harsh banging on the front door. It was so loud that it shook the walls and even the entire house. I could hear that it was coming from the front door, and I could even hear them violently shaking the door handle. It was such a sudden burst of chaos that it was difficult for me to know what to do. So I turned off the shower and quickly I got dressed. But as soon as I left my room and started walking down the upstairs hallway, everything stopped. There were no more sounds, just the wind from outside, and I felt a sense of unease. I then slowly made my way downstairs and up to the front door, but no one was there. I hurried to the window and saw that the car was still there, but the man was not inside, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. I called the police, and when they arrived, they saw several sets of footprints in the snow, but the storm soon covered them up. They took the car's license plate and discovered a photo of the owner, and from what I could tell, it was the same guy I'd helped on my porch. Over the next few days, they waited for him to show up, but as far as I know, he never did. It's quite unsettling to consider what might have happened that night right outside my door, trying to enter for some reason or someone else with more malevolent intent. Most people seem to believe that the man was fleeing from someone and attempting to get assistance, but what transpired afterward is still up for debate. There are many unanswered questions about that night, including where the man is now and what he was running from. It was a snowy night when I pulled into the parking lot of my gas station. I worked the overnight shift from 11 o'clock to 7 o'clock, and I had been there for a few months. I really didn't like this job, but I couldn't find another place to work, and because of the circumstances in other parts of my life, night shifts were the best for my schedule. Even though I was exhausted every night and found it difficult to finish each shift, I parked in front of the building next to my co-workers, and I went inside and relieved him of his shift. Left a few minutes later, and I spent the remainder of the night alone. My manager had a paper on the desk with some tasks that needed to be done, but after reading it, I estimated that it wouldn't take more than an hour to finish them all. I tried to put it off as long as possible to avoid falling asleep once I started to get really tired, but as I sat behind the desk and around 12 a.m. a vehicle arrived at the station, I looked out the window and saw an old SUV parked by one of the pumps. Since it was snowing outside, most people weren't driving, but occasionally getting a customer was normal. I returned to my phone and watched some videos without paying much attention for about 10 minutes before I looked back outside and saw the SUV was still there by the pump. The doors were closed and the headlights were off, giving the impression that they should be pumping gas, but it had been, so I got up and moved closer to the window, looking along both sides of the building, but no one was outside. If they had been in their car for the last 10 minutes with it off, they must have been freezing. It was windy, snowy, and cold, so I was genuinely a little anxious for them. For the next few minutes, I kept a closer eye out for any movement through the dark windows or for someone to return to their vehicle, but nothing happened. It seemed as though the automobile had been abandoned next to the pump. After giving it some thought, I put on my jacket and went outside right away. I knew I was correct. It was far too cold for anyone to be inside with the car off or to be outside for longer than a few minutes. I hurried over to the car, looked around, put my face up against the window, and tried to look inside. I called out, "Hello, anyone in there? Just checking to see if you're okay." But from what I could see, there wasn't anyone inside. It wasn't exactly easy to see, so someone could have been, but I was pretty sure there wasn't, so I retreated. I got up, took a look around the empty gas station parking lot, and then started to walk back. This time, instead of focusing on the car, I was just staring at the ground, when I noticed shoe prints in the snow heading toward the building, not really the front of the building, but kind of off to the side. Looking back, I saw that they appeared to come from the car, but at this point, I was freezing and didn't want to investigate further without first warming up a little inside. I turned on the small heater next to the counter and placed my hands in front of it to keep them warm. I had only been inside for 30 to 60 seconds when I heard a thump coming from behind me. I turned around without seeing anything, then walked around the counter and toward the back, where I could see puddles of filthy water that looked like snow that had melted off someone's boots on the floor. I felt a chill go through me as I approached the back room and turned the corner to face the supply room. I could make out the shape of I don't know why, but after staring at the supply room doorway for I don't even know how long, I silently picked up the store phone and called the police. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and had a large, scruffy beard, and they were staring right at me. My heart stopped for a moment, but after the initial shock, I just walked back to the counter. I whispered for assistance, and then went through the most terrifying 10 minutes of my life, as I didn't hear or see anything from the supply room during this time, which, for some reason, made me more afraid. When the police officers eventually pulled up and entered, I told them where the man was, and they searched the room while I stayed by the front. When they emerged alone, I was shocked to see that the man had vanished. Watery shoe prints surrounded the back door, but there were fresh tracks outside. The snow flowed directly from the gas station into the completely dark, empty field that led on 4 miles. Obviously, no one could search that at night, but even when they did in the days that followed, they found nothing. The field was so large that he could have gone anywhere, but it was so windy and cold that night that I was almost certain they would find a body. The SUV was taken in for hopefully more information. I'm not sure how or why, but they were unable to locate any history of ownership, leaving us with only what we know from that evening. We still don't know who the man was, what he was doing, or where he is today. Query: I do overeat on the weekends and occasionally on days when classes are not in session. This occurred a few weeks prior to our school's holiday break. It was a Friday night, and since I had nothing planned, I thought it would be a good idea to earn some money rather than sit around the house all day. I started driving and set up the app to begin receiving orders. I believe it was 600 p.m. when I started, and I completed a few orders before I received one to pick up from a local Burger King once. It wasn't snowing outside, but it was really cold and windy, and there was still a light layer of snow on the roadways from earlier in the day. I got the food and checked the address on the app. At first, it was obvious that it wasn't a house address, but when I zoomed in, I was a little more perplexed to see that it was at the corner of 2 streets, looking like maybe a gas station. Despite thinking it was strange, I clicked begin route and started driving over. I didn't think it was a bad thing. I just thought it would be an awkward interaction, because I'd probably have to find the person in the parking lot and give it to them directly. Normally, I don't see the customers. Quick drop-off as I approached and drove up to the intersection where it was located. The gas station itself appeared normal, but there were no cars in the parking lot. I pulled in and parked in one of the spots at the back, then stayed in my car and tried to look around for anyone. The app should have alerted them that I had arrived, so I was expecting someone to be out here waiting for me. But even after a few minutes, nobody was there. I sent a text through the app just notifying them that I was waiting for them in the parking lot. I got out of my car to get a better look around. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I became. I checked my phone and saw no response from the customer. I was about to get back into my car when a truck pulled into the gas station. Passing the pumps and parking just a few spots away was an older pickup with tinted windows and a dark crimson color. My first thought was, why would they order for delivery if they were just going to drive here anyway? I had previously assumed that they might be a gas station employee or simply hanging out here for some reason, but now this was much more suspicious than it had been. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged from the truck. From the first glance, he had a very dished appearance, as one might expect from someone living on the road, and his clothes appeared filthy. stained and torn as he emerged. I held up the bag with a small smile, but the man didn't even look at it. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on me as he got closer. Something struck me, making me want to leave right away. I put the bag on the ground, and almost immediately the man began to walk more quickly, as if he knew I was going to leave. I got in my car and started backing out just as the man reached my door, but he ran back to his truck, leaving the food on the ground. The truck attempted to follow me for a minute before turning away. Once I was safe, I called the police, but nothing really came of it. As I was leaving the gas station, I saw him quickly return and begin speeding toward the exit I was leaving from. I floored it, going through a red light and just speeding down the road until I reached where more cars were. In the heat of the moment, I didn't even consider checking the man's license plate. Looking back, I'm not sure if he had one. I don't know what he was doing, and I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. But knowing that I was so close to learning the truth is still terrifying. I work as a delivery driver for my neighborhood Papa John's. Since I'm a college student, this is one of the few jobs I can choose from. A few of my friends also work here, but since we're all delivery drivers, we don't really get to see each other even when we have the same shifts. This happened to me last December while I was taking on some extra shifts. Before Christmas, it was snowing a lot this evening, which made deliveries take longer than usual and resulted in more deliveries than usual. I wasn't overly anxious about work, but going non-stop 4 hours on end wasn't as fun. At 9:30, I picked up my next set of orders to deliver and got into my car to check the directions. I had 2 orders, and although the houses were only 5 minutes apart, they were both quite far from the shop. 15 minutes, which was more like 25 minutes in this weather. The first part of the drive was normal, but then it started to take me toward the less frequented area of town, where the houses were older and the majority of the shops had closed. No one ever came here unless they lived here, because it was so old and simply wasn't up to today's standards. I entered one of the communities after 20 minutes of driving and proceeded down the street in the direction of the first home. There were no cars parked on the side of the road, and most of the houses appeared to be empty. When I arrived at the first address, I parked on the road and went up to the front door. A friendly old man answered the door and paid for the pizza. I then went back and set the directions for the next house, which was in the same neighborhood, but as I drove, I noticed that it was taking me deeper into the neighborhood to the point where there were fewer houses and more space between them. By the time I arrived at the address, there were only trees surrounding the area once more. Nevertheless, it was quite chilly outside, and the snow was getting my clothes wet. Eventually, a minute later, the door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman who appeared to have just woken up. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were emotionless and exhausted. "I have the 2 pizzas you ordered," I said. "Hold out the boxes and give me the total to pay." She accepted the boxes and set them on the table beside her, then instructed me to wait for her to fetch the money. Another minute passed before they opened the door. Once more, she began sorting through some cash, counting it slowly, and attempting to add it all up. There was definitely something strange about her. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly what it was, but everything she was doing was very strange. Then, as if she wasn't having enough trouble counting the cash, she struck up a conversation with me about normal things, like how my day was going. I politely replied, but it was really strange. Like she was stalling at one point. While she was speaking, I glanced back at my car to temporarily escape the uncomfortable situation. But as soon as I did, I noticed a man standing right next to it. He was looking in the windows and working on the door. However, when I turned to face the woman again, her expression had changed to one of rage. I realized this too late, though, as she reached out and grabbed me before yelling at the man by my car, who turned around and began running towards us. The woman attempted to pull me into the house, but I pushed her away and managed to break free. Then my instincts took over, and I ran into the trees. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps crunching in the snow behind me all the way through the forest, until finally they began to fade away. After 2 minutes of running, I stopped to catch my breath. Fortunately, the moon was lighting up the forest enough for me to get through it and back to one of the neighborhood streets. I called 911, and after 10 minutes of waiting in the cold, an officer arrived. Another patrol car went to the I discovered the man outside attempting to break into my car and attempt to stop things from getting worse. The couple was probably running low on money, so they turned to robbing my car as a diversion. Since I saw what he was doing, it's unclear what they would have done. Perhaps they would have simply let me go, but it's obvious that I would have reported them. So I don't think it's likely they would have. I'm simply grateful that I escaped unscathed, that I was the first victim they tried it on before being arrested, and that I was never able to harm anyone. Otherwise, it was January, and I was renting out a winter home near an ice fishing lake. It was a tiny, basic cabin with simply the necessities, and it was only available to folks like myself who enjoyed visiting the lake for ice or fishing. I usually went fishing with a friend, but occasionally I went alone and never had any problems. I had 3 days planned, and the only real plans I had were to sit by the lake and fish. On the first day, I set up my belongings in the cabin and made myself at home by making hot coffee and lounging by the fireplace for the majority of the afternoon. Since the cabin was only one room, the bed, fireplace, and everything else were all in one place, so I went to bed early and woke up early. I got up at 7 a.m. to walk to the lake, which was approximately 10 minutes away from the cabin via a short, snow-covered forest path. I located a decent site, set up my equipment, drilled into the ice, and began fishing. I find that simply sitting there and fishing relieves a lot of stress. Even though I am aware that many people find it boring, I spent several hours, roughly 3 or 4, on the lake before packing my belongings because the snow was beginning to accumulate and the wind was becoming stronger. I then left the lake and returned to the path, but as soon as I did, I saw a set of footprints in the snow that were right next to mine from earlier. They went all the way up to the lake's edge, at which point they turned around and headed back down the path toward the cabin, feeling a little uneasy that someone was out here and had been right. Perhaps observing me from behind, I decided to follow the prints and see where they led. They mostly followed the path that led directly back to the cabin, but instead of going up to the cabin, they veered off into the woods. From what I could see, they continued in a straight line through the trees, leaving me even more perplexed and a little uneasy. I returned inside the cabin and warmed up by the fireplace, because there was nothing else in the area 4 miles. Therefore, anyone being out here was just strange, especially in the winter. I cooked and spent the rest of the night in the cabin, keeping the fireplace going and mostly reading. However, about an hour after sunset, I heard movement outside, a very light crunching in the snow, but in the recognizable pattern of someone walking. So I went to the window and looked right away and saw a figure out by the trees walking toward the path. They were dressed in thick clothing that covered every part of them, making it difficult to see what they looked like. However, once they reached the path, they turned and headed straight for the cabin. I ducked my head down and listened to the footsteps as they got closer and closer until they reached the wall. The footsteps then moved to the side, approaching the window where I was hiding under their shadow, moving as if they were looking inside the cabin. When they stopped, I tilted my head up to see their eyes gazing back at me. A few minutes later, I packed up and fled the area from my car. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but they knew I was staying there after seeing me at the lake and willingly came back in the middle of the night to try and break in through the window. So they definitely had something horrible in mind. Fortunately, I got out unharmed, but I have a feeling that night was almost my. I spent Christmas with my roommate 2 years ago. We were both in college and shared a small house in the suburbs outside of campus. Neither of our families seemed to celebrate Christmas very much, and we were also somewhat broke, so we spent winter break at home. Despite this, we did some decorating and had each other inexpensive small gifts, so we could have our own little Christmas. But aside from that, our main plans were to watch movies and possibly attend a party at night on Christmas Day. After opening our presents and hanging out, My roommate wanted to attend a party near the campus, which I'd also intended to attend, but at around 5 I encouraged him to go if he wanted to because, for some reason, I was just tired and not really in the mood to go out. He accepted the offer and left by 6. I sat back and ate some junk food, watched TV, and generally relaxed. But around 8 I just felt like getting up and doing something. So I grabbed my jacket and decided to go for a walk around to look at the houses with Christmas lights. It was cold outside, but not unbearably cold. Neighborhood and through one of the neighboring parks. But as I was walking along a section of the path, I came across a man sitting on a bench. This section of the path was covered in trees rather than any houses, and the man was sitting there by himself. It was actually kind of depressing, but when I passed by, he looked up at me and gave me this really cold look. It was very strange, and it made me even more curious as to why he was out here. I walked faster, reaching the end of the path and turning back to go for the remainder of the walk home. All I could think about was the man and what he was up to. Something about his appearance just made me feel uneasy. I arrived at the house, opened the front door, closed it behind me, and removed my shoes, but before I could even turn to leave, I heard a thump outside the door, which startled me because it had come so quickly. I leaned over and peered through the peephole, and it was the man from the path was standing on the porch and staring at the door. His face was completely blank, with neither a smile nor a frown. I cracked open the door and asked, "Are you okay?" The man looked at me with emotionless eyes and said nothing. I asked again if he was okay or if he needed anything, but he remained silent, becoming uncomfortable. I closed the door and resumed staring out the peephole. The man remained there for at least a minute before moving to the side of the door. Until he was out of my perspective, I turned to see that the window curtains were open, giving the man a view of my house. For some reason, I didn't want the man to see me, so I was afraid to close the curtains. He could probably only see the couch and the Christmas tree, but it was still very unsettling to know that he was looking into my house. As I stood there trying to figure out what to do next, a dull thud came from outside the window. I took a hasty step back and saw the man, his eyes still glazed out, bang a big rock against the window. I fled and locked myself in a room while I dialed 911, listening to the man keep hitting the window. After a few hits, there was a pause, and then it started again, but it sounded like he might have moved to hitting the front door. This continued for what seemed like several minutes before it finally stopped. When the police arrived, the man was nowhere to be seen outside, despite the fact that the police seemed to believe that it was just an inebriated person based on the information I gave them, and he probably had no real reason to target me specifically. Nevertheless, the way he was acting was just insane, and there's no telling what he would have done if he had gotten in. There were several cracks in the window, and the door had whole pieces of wood smashed out and lying on the ground. Completed. I've been a police officer for my county for about 10 years. During that time, I've witnessed some bizarre and unsettling things that have occasionally made me wonder why I picked this line of work. But what happened on this particular night really lingers with me, and is frequently the thing I think about the most. It was getting close to the end of winter, but where I live, it doesn't become warm until about mid-spring. This evening, I was scheduled to spend the majority of my shift patrolling the main highway. Normally, I would patrol assignments were typically the most dull and uninteresting. They would typically stop 2 or 3 automobiles for speeding and do little else. Occasionally, a call for backup would come in, up until around 2 in the morning. I was traveling down the highway in the typical circle when I noticed a car on the side of the road that wasn't there before. Its lights were off, and it was far on the shoulder of the highway, so I assumed it was just an abandoned, broken down car that I might not have noticed earlier, so I wasn't in a rush. I pulled in behind it, parking about 15 feet away, and left my headlights on. I called in to report that I was investigating a presumably empty vehicle on the southbound highway. Then I got out with my flashlight and approached it. My initial impression of the car was how old it was. It appeared to be from the 1990s and was completely corroded, with dents and scratches. I approached the driver's side window and raised my flashlight. No one was inside, but as I shone it around, I noticed some extremely concerning indicators. There was a pile of clothes in the back seat that appeared to belong to a young woman, but the way they were strewn about didn't seem right. So I moved to the opposite side of the car, but I heard a faint sound behind me. I quickly turned and aimed my spotlight into the woods that surrounded the highway. The sound ceased right away, but I could tell it was footsteps. Someone was strolling outside, possibly even observing me. I yelled at them to raise their hands and step into the light. A second later, I yelled again, but no one responded. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I called in to provide an update on the situation and to fall back up to come. I held up my gun and moved further behind the car, keeping an eye on the tree line without revealing my entire body. The next 5 minutes were incredibly nerve-wracking, but when another officer arrived, I immediately heard footsteps running deeper into the woods. I stood there staring into the woods, genuinely fearing for my life, because if something had happened here, there would be a reason for whoever was out there to try and stop me from finding out. We started searching the car right away, and it was obvious that something was going on. However, searching the woods in the middle of the night while a potentially dangerous person was out there was not a safe option. In addition to signs of violence, we discovered an empty ammunition package, which suggests that they had a firearm on them. Knowing that someone was watching me the entire time, possibly even having me in the line of sight, is one of the most unsettling feelings. The next day, we were able to obtain more details and conduct a more exhaustive investigation, but the car was untraceable, and while some shoe prints were discovered in the woods, they quickly vanished without any indication of what actually happened that evening. The case is still open, with no leads on suspects or victims, which has left me unable to stop thinking about it. 4 years ago, I rented an Airbnb to stay in for the holidays. I was spending the week of Christmas with my family, so I chose a place that was only a few miles away. When I arrived on December 20th, everything was exactly as I had anticipated. It was a very normal house in a very normal neighborhood, and overall, I was satisfied. I arrived around 6 o'clock on the first day, but I didn't feel like going out to see anyone until I had a good night's rest, watching TV, and even doing some work. I went to bed just before 10 o'clock and fell asleep, but in the middle of the night, I slowly woke up to a noise coming from downstairs. I was still half asleep and didn't even check the time, but as I listened to the noises, I didn't really feel concerned or anything. Instead, I just assumed that the house was making these noises. I only stayed awake for a minute before falling back asleep, and I don't remember waking up any other times during the night. I told my family that I had arrived in town, and we set up our place for dinner at their place. By morning, I had forgotten and didn't even consider the noises I was hearing again. I was very certain it was simply the AC unit or something. I spent the entire morning and afternoon unwinding at the Airbnb until I was ready to leave. I picked up my keys and suitcase and went to the front door to leave, but when I opened it, I was utterly taken aback to see a man standing in front of me on the porch, and I just stood there staring at him for a moment before I even said, "Can I help you?" The man didn't knock or ring the doorbell, which made me wonder how long he could have been standing there and why he was here in the first place. Instead of answering my question, he simply nodded and left. I watched him go down to the sidewalk and keep walking down the street until he was gone. I can't think of any circumstance where this wouldn't be strange and unsettling. Why was he at the Airbnb, and how long was he standing there without after making sure the place was locked? I drove to my parents' house for dinner with the family. I brought up the incident as an interesting story, and everyone else seemed to think it was just as creepy as I did. Dinner was still nice, and we had lots of other wonderful conversations catching up on life and everything, but I couldn't stop thinking about that man the entire night. I ended up leaving the dinner get-together around 9 o'clock and returning to the Airbnb 15 minutes later. I parked in the driveway, approached the front door, and looked around for any obvious signs that someone had been there while I was away, but I didn't see anything. I unlocked the door, went down to the end of the hallway, and entered the kitchen, leaving my keys and bag on the counter. Suddenly, there was a thump that sounded exactly like the ones I had heard the night before. But now that I was downstairs, it was much louder and obviously coming from one side of the house. I cautiously entered the room close to where the sound was coming from. Then there was another thump from a door next to me. I jumped back, feeling a rush of adrenaline, and after staring at the door for a few seconds, I heard the faint sound of heavy breathing from the other side. I grabbed my keys and ran for my car, not knowing exactly what was going on, but I wasn't going to stay and find out on my own. I called 911, waited for them to arrive, and watched them go in and search for a few minutes before they came out and told me something horrifying about the door. Unbeknownst to me, there was a side door linked to the garage that led outdoors and had been left unlocked by whoever had stayed here before me. Behind the garage door, there were traces of distress from someone probably trying to break the latch and get inside. I never checked the garage because I never intended to use it. It's unclear if the man I saw on the porch was the same one in the garage, but the fact that I was asleep when someone was attempting to get into the house directly below me is I went and slept at a hotel for the remainder of the week after that. But I still find myself wondering about that circumstance even after 4 years. It's terrible what they were trying to accomplish after breaking in, and we have no way of knowing. Later, it was early December. This evening, I spent my day off at home by the fireplace because it was much too cold and snowy outside. I completed a number of tasks around the house that needed to be done, but other than that, it was a calm day. The news was playing in the background, and I was listening to how strong winds and potential blizzards were predicted to begin tonight at 5, around 7. I noticed that the weather was becoming worse outside, so I sat on the couch and switched to a different channel even though I could hear the wind banging against the house. It sounded like there was a blizzard, so I got up and went to the window facing the backyard to see what was going on. At first, all I saw was snow rushing to the ground with almost no visibility, but then I saw something else, a figure walking through my backyard. Since my backyard was quite large and had no fence, it wouldn't have been all that surprising if there hadn't been a blizzard going on outside. Whoever was out there was just walking at a regular pace toward the end of my yard before the snow and darkness obscured my view of them. I spent a minute near the window. I went back to the TV, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. I went over and cracked it open, and it was a man in a heavy winter. I was genuinely afraid for them, but I also couldn't see why they would be out there at all. The end of my yard that they were walking to led to a road, but it wouldn't get them anywhere 4 miles, which was not doable on foot. His face was pale white and his nose was bright red, as if he had been out in the cold for some time. I couldn't tell if this was the same person I had seen in my backyard, but my first thought was, "How can I help you?" I asked the man, who smiled humbly and said through trembling teeth that he was waiting for a ride to pick him up, and asked if he could stay in my house for a short while to protect himself from the cold until the ride arrived. I took a moment to reply because given the current weather, it's easy to argue that you would never allow a stranger inside your home. But when they are literally freezing to death on your doorstep and pleading for your assistance, the solution isn't as clear-cut. I offered to give him my old jacket if he needed it and told him he could wait on my porch, which didn't have an overhang that blocked the snow. The man didn't seem overly pleased, but he nodded and moved to the side to sit on the chair I had there, closed and locked the door before going upstairs to get my old jacket. It was much too big for me and in terrible shape, but obviously that shouldn't matter in this kind of situation. I picked it up and headed downstairs to unlock and open the door, but something stopped me just in time. I'm not sure what it was, but it made me hesitate. The man was now standing just in front of the door, his hand on the handle, if he were about to push it. When I leaned over and peered through the peephole, I felt my pulse rate rise as soon as I opened it, so I took a few steps back and discreetly got out my phone to call 911 while whispering into it. When the police stated they were on their way, I just gazed at the door with wide eyes, knowing what was waiting for me on the other side. I cautiously crept over and peeked out again, but the man was nowhere to be found, not on my porch or in my front yard. As if he knew that I had contacted the police, I'm not sure what he would have done if I had opened the door, but I hope he never shows up. Nothing else was discovered that evening, and he never appeared again. Back last year, I was spending the holidays with my family, who live 15 hours away. Normally, I try to make it in one long drive, but this year's early snowfall made driving much slower, so I was ready to stop at a hotel somewhere along the way. I didn't make any reservations ahead of time because I didn't know how far I'd go before wanting to stop. I was just going to pull into wherever and see if they had a room available. When I left, it was hardly snowing, but the farther I went, the more snow seemed to be falling. The roads were still clear, but everyone was driving more cautiously and slowly. After 8 hours of driving, I still hadn't reached halfway, and I was getting frustrated because it was already 9:00 p.m. Have been halfway there by now, but it was taking so long that I felt compelled to continue in order to avoid making my drive tomorrow even longer. The snow had slightly decreased, but it had still accumulated on the road because there were no plow trucks. I drove as far as I could until 12 a.m. before deciding that I had had enough and needed some rest. I drove off the next exit and into a small motel parking lot. It was a long, one-story building with about 10 rooms, and as might be expected, it wasn't the nicest place. The outside looked really old, and even the lights on the sign were dim and half burned out. I parked in a random spot close to the rooms, got out, and walked up to the main entrance area. Inside, there was a very small room with a front desk, but there was a sign propped up on the counter. It said "Be back in 15 inches" with a small picture of a coffee cup on it. The likelihood that I would arrive while the employee was taking their break just demonstrated my lack of luck on this drive. I went outside and back to my car, but this time, when I looked around the parking lot, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. It was completely empty. I stood there in the cold for a minute and didn't see a single car, and it didn't look like any cars had been there tonight. I got back in my car and I sat back and tried to think of what to do next, but my eyes and head were so exhausted that I ended up passing out in my seat. A few hours later, the snow had started to pour down again, and the wind was making my car uncomfortable. As I waited, seeing no cars and no one at the desk made me wonder if the sign was actually for someone taking a break. There were no places within 15 minutes, so I don't know where they could have driven off to if they were taking a break. As soon as I sat up and turned to face the motel's front door, I saw a man looking in through my window. He moved away and shouted something in the direction of the parking lot, making me jump back. I turned to look behind him and saw that another man had gotten out of a pickup on the other side, the driver's side, and began to approach the one next to me before circling my vehicle. I tried every door handle before snapping out of it, putting my car in reverse and attempting to back out before the soldiers were now going more quickly as the wheels churned beneath me, shouting at the other to approach him and smash the rear window. I kept driving my car back,